everyone. My name is Daniel Rodic, and I am here with Nadia Boujarwah, co-founder and CEO of Dia&Co. Nadia, how are you?
I'm doing great. I love your entry music.
Thank
That
you
was
so much.
I really enjoyed that interlude. That was very cool.
It's very calming, kind of zen to get us ready for the day. But how are you? Where are you calling in from right now? What city are you in?
I live in New York City. I'm outside the city in Connecticut right now, but
Very nice.
otherwise in New York.
New York, New York. It's so interesting. One thing I wanted to kick off on, actually, I've had this string of New York founders that I've been speaking to, and it's always a very small world. Because last week or 2 weeks ago, I spoke to Heidi Zach at Third Love, and I remember seeing a bunch of stuff that at least you've been on each other's shows and blogs and all that.
Yeah,
And then I guess last week we had Melanie Travis from Andy Swim, which you launched a collection with, and she had mentioned that. So I'm just curious to start there. How did that whole partnership come together? Is just like a New York ecosystem thing, or what's the story behind that?
We've partnered with both those brands. Big fans of both Third Love and Andy Swim. Andy anchored a swim category launch for us in March, and swim is a category that we've heard kind of consistently from our customers is particularly painful, but something she really wants to be able to participate in more. We actually did a survey right before we launched Swim, and one of the questions was, would you rather get a root canal or go shopping for bathing suits? And 43% of our customers said that they would rather get a root canal.
Wow.
And so, we leapt to the challenge of figuring out what a delightful experience could look like for her in Swim. And a big part of that were awesome bathing suits from brands like Andy Swim. We've been big fans of theirs for a long time. They've been leaders in inclusivity and have such great products. So it was really an honor to work with them.
That's amazing. I feel like your surveys are a lot more fun than the surveys I take too.
Honestly, I'm like a data junkie, and it's so funny sometimes, like how, we debated what we should contrast shopping bathing suits with. Somebody in our team wanted to ask, would you rather walk over hot coals or shop for a bathing suit? We landed on root canal.
That's interesting.
But suffice to say, it's not a fan favorite.
It makes me feel like some of those personality tests where they give you like two options over and over and over again to like really make sure, do you really want to do this or not? Are you really this type or this type? But I'm so excited to chat with you. I know we've been at different dinners. We've been emailing for so many years, and we never had a chance to sit down and just talk about you and your story. And there's so much I want to do to talk about Dia&Co. But before we get there, I always like to start at the very, very beginning. And I'm trying to do my research to figure out where exactly I would say you grew up. And it seems like it's Miami was one place, and then sounds like you might have also moved around to a bunch of other places. But so where did you grow up? What would you say when someone asked you that question? Where did you grow up, and what was that like as a kid? What did you hope to be when you grew up back then?
Yeah, I grew up in Kuwait. So there were short stints during the first Gulf War and other times when my family was not in Kuwait, but otherwise, I grew up in Kuwait, and I lived in Kuwait until I came to the US for college when I was 18. I have a lot of family in Miami, so your research is not wrong. But I grew up in Kuwait. And what did I want to be when I grew up? Is that what you asked?
Back then, what did back when I was a kid, the word entrepreneur was like not a thing. And so my parents were like, are you going to be a doctor? Are you going to be a lawyer? I like to talk a lot. So it's like, oh, you'd probably be a good lawyer. I'm like, looking back now, I'm like, I don't know if I would be a good lawyer at all.
Yeah. I think I always wanted to be in business. My sister and I used to pretend that, and we were very young, I don't know how we came up with these ideas, but we used to pretend that we were distributors of Fisher Price toys because that's what we had. And so we would, pretend, get faxes and phone calls with orders and, do business in our playroom.
That's amazing.
I think we probably sold more Fisher Price toys than Fisher Price realized. Totally kidding. We didn't actually sell anything, but it was a very fun operation.
So before college, did you ever start any kind of business or some side hustle, or was that ever part of your childhood?
I feel like I was always dreaming about business. My parents are both academics, and I'm a classic middle child. And so I feel like I was always, trying to do like I was always trying to be practical and not, kind of go down the path of being an academic. And so I think that probably fueled more early exploration in business, but I've always kind of been on that side of the fence.
That's very cool. I mean, the reason I ask is I'm so curious of like where did the spark of inspiration of like, oh, here's how we're going to play with the toys. It's not going to be whatever imaginary thing you do with toys, whatever. It's like, we're going to try to buy and sell these toys with our little fake fax machine. And
I don't know, honestly. Like, it must have come. I really have no idea. And the funny thing is that we would like hire our friends to do business with us too. Like, this was like a multi-household, operation.
That's amazing. You scaled, you hired, you did all the things.
Yeah, good early practice.
That's all it is. So you're in Kuwait, and then you end up at UPenn. How did you decide as UPenn is the place to go to college? Why not stay home? Why not go somewhere in Florida? How did you pick to do, I guess, finance or economics at UPenn?
Yeah, I mean, these things are always kind of funny in retrospect. So I went to the American school in Kuwait, which is a very small, kind of private school. I think I graduated in a class of 50 or 60. And the year ahead of me in high school, the three smartest people, as far as I could tell, had all gone to Penn. And so I thought,
that's the place.
My goal is to go to Penn. That is my that's where I want to go. And I applied to Penn early decision, and I got in. So I never ended up applying anywhere else. And
Simple.
that was all she wrote. Yeah.
Very, very simple. And so then you obviously jumped into finance after that. Was that was it the same kind of story of everyone was going into banking and finance? And how did you end up at I guess Weinberg Partners, Perella Weinberg Partners?
Yeah. So I hate to say that I didn't have more active choice in these things, but I went to Wharton undergrad, and at that time, investment banking was still kind of the most sought after jobs. This was 2008. So, being a summer intern in 2007 was probably the heyday of investment banking because nothing had crashed yet.
Yeah.
I was very lucky in that my internship was at a boutique investment bank at the time. They had just started, Perella Weinberg Partners. And so by the time we graduated in 2008, a lot of my classmates had their offers rescinded because the banks were just not hiring or no longer in business, one or the other. But it was actually a great time to be at a boutique investment bank. The bank had no balance sheet. And so, it was kind of, it was a group of people that were hired purely on the merit of their advice. And we ended up doing really interesting work. Financial services was the name of the game back then. And I got to work on advising the FDIC on bank failures and all kinds of fun projects that I actually really enjoyed it. I worked with an incredible group of people. It was a great formative experience.
It's a startup in the world of investment banks, as it sounds like, if they just got started when you joined.
It really was.
I don't know if that was the only one that piqued your interest, but how did you, because I went to a business undergrad too here in Toronto. Same story for me, was consulting, and that was the path. But then Ray, who I ended up starting a company with, kind of rescued me from that that path of the world. And I eventually started, like in my last year of school, I started working with him on building our first subscription box business. But had that not happened, I would be at McKinsey, Bain, BCG, or some version of that, 100%. Right. For you, how did the natural choice normally is not the startup investment bank. Normally it's Goldman, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan. Was there anything that stood out, or how did that come to be?
It's funny, like what you prioritize earlier in your life. I still very much thought that I would move back to the Middle East and, kind of get some experience in the US and then move back to Kuwait. And even though Perella Weinberg was very young, they had incredible backing and presence in the Middle East. Of maybe 10 founding investors in the bank, 2 were actually from Kuwait. And I thought, this seems like a good place to get really good experience and then, potentially be in a good place to go back to Kuwait, which of course never happened. But that was the original the original. But in reality, though, I think it's like actually not that dissimilar from people who may choose to join a very early stage company now, which is that you're joining a group of people, right? And if you really enjoy the group of people and you think it's a group of people who you're going to be able to learn a lot from, it's always a good trade. And that's what it was. It was, I was in the first analyst class at the bank, which means that I worked with the most senior people always. And I just had a set of experiences that even a couple years before, when the most senior partners were at Goldman or at Morgan Stanley, somebody of my tenure would have never interacted with them. And I was kind of in every room, and it just felt like I was, I just thought it was going to be a more, a steeper learning curve, and then therefore a better experience.
Yeah. I like this thread. Maybe I'm just presupposing it, but it's from childhood to your first kind of real job out of school. It's a startup. You then choose to go to Harvard. A lot of people pick their MBAs with the desire to change careers or change. What was your intention when you went to your MBA? Was there a goal in mind, or was it simply go there and figure out what happens next?
I really didn't know. I think that I had done the standard 3-year analyst program, and, then you're supposed to do all these things that are already very predetermined. And I didn't really want to do any of those things, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do next. And so, I think business school is certainly not a required thing in anybody's life, but when it's possible, I think it can be very helpful, especially when you're exploring a lot of different things. And so I did. I went to business school and tried to figure out what I really wanted to do for the rest of my life. And as luck would have it, I kind of learned a lot more about the plus size market. And so here we are.
And so that's where you meet your co-founder that you end up starting Dia&Co with. Was this the first idea that's like, we're going to do plus size clothing and attack the market? Or were there other business ideas along the way? Kind of what was the winding path to eventually say, here's the thing we're gonna stake our next couple of months, couple of years on building?
Yeah. I think this is like, timing is really important. And I think that, so I went to HBS 2011 through 2013. And that was a time when, certainly banking and increasingly consulting were less popular, kind of career paths. And every school was trying to compete with GSB to figure out how to be the entrepreneurial business school of choice. And tech was just rising in prominence. And I think that because of that, even the curriculum at HBS at the time was much more entrepreneurial. They gave us all capital to start businesses at school. And so we kind of played around with a lot of ideas. And it was very much, that was the environment. It was very kind of focused on that. And I also, very importantly, I think by that moment in time, there had already been a string of HBS founders, particularly HBS female founders, that had already had a lot of success. And, the power of pattern recognition in every part of the ecosystem is just really, really strong, right? It's a reason why representation is so important. And so, I think I was very interested to join a startup, but I don't think that I would have founded a company if it weren't specifically for this problem. I have been plus all my life, and I've always loved fashion. I've always loved style. It's always been important to me to be able to express myself through my clothing. But I'd never really thought about it outside of my own experiences. It was actually something that I was kind of embarrassed about and really didn't talk much about. And the serendipity that brought us here is an article in the New York Times in 2012. So at the beginning of our second year at HBS, in the New York Times, there was an article about the rise of plus size style bloggers. This was like this was still like, kind of web blogs, and Instagram was just coming on the scene. And it was so fascinating to me, because prior to that, the reality is that all taste making and style was still happening in these very exclusive circles, whether they be magazines or TV or film. And all of a sudden, the New York Times was talking about women who looked a lot more like me being, heralded as style tastemakers. And I thought, this is interesting. Like, it feels like there's something that's happening here. The conversation is changing. I wonder what's happening in the plus size market. What is the plus size market? And, honestly, in a lot of ways, that's a rabbit hole that we started going down and we've just never come out of, because
And
it was just like,
it's quite serendipitous. And so you tend like you were friends with Lydia at this point?
yeah, we actually we started by writing a paper in one of our classes on the plus size market and why we thought that really taste making and style was changing. And that meant that marginalized groups were going to become increasingly important from a spending perspective, which was the beginning of, what is now a set of strongly, strongly held beliefs around how this market can and should operate, and therefore what our North Star is as a business.
Mm. And so you're jamming with her on this idea, and obviously Harvard's very supportive of all this, but there's a gap between like when you finish Harvard and when Dia officially starts. There's so many different ways we can talk about this, but as you're working on this idea, what's the story of when you're graduating? Everyone's probably trying to get offers and this and that Dia&Co wasn't the next thing you did, but instead you both, I think she went to Google, you went to the jewelry company.
Startup, yeah.
Yeah, another startup. So how did that come about? What's the story behind that?
I mean, it was an interesting idea, but we never came at this problem with a business in mind. It was always like a really interesting problem that we thought about and we talked to so many people about, but it wasn't clear that a business was the answer or that a specific business could be the answer. And so we didn't kind of leap to that conclusion, and we did the responsible thing and took jobs and started earning an income again.
It's a big chunk to go to Harvard, so it's slowly got to pay it down, right?
Yeah, but it was like one of these things that it was in the back of our heads. And Lydia and I have been, best friends for a long time, and so we would talk all the time about this like idea that just like kept on coming back. And we reached out to all the bloggers who were in that New York Times article and talked to them and put out surveys to their followers and just talked to a bunch of people. And it felt like the more people we talked to, the more clear it was that there could be a solution to this market, and that no one was really thinking about it that way. At a high level, just to kind of give everyone a sense for the magnitude of the problem that we work on, there are, I'll give you 2019 stats because I think that these stats have probably changed in the last 2 years, but I don't have new ones yet. So at the beginning of 2020, about 67% of American women wore what the industry classified as plus sizes, which is broadly speaking a size 12 to 14 and up. That same group of women, which is about 100 million adult women, spend less than 20% of apparel dollars in the US. And that gap is something that is not contested at all. Right? Everybody understands these stats. It's a very well understood phenomenon that supply and demand seem to be grossly mismatched. And there's just been, there just hasn't been a lot of success. And these stats have been this way for decades, right? This is certainly not a new phenomenon. And the industry just hasn't been able to agree on exactly what to do about it. And
these are 2019 stats, which I imagine 2012 to 2014, when you're looking at this, the gap is the same, if not wider at that point.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think both sides of the equation have changed, right? I think that, our community is really in every way the mainstream. And I think that there's been a lot of progress on the supply side, but I think that there is a lot more marketing and PR than there is actual products and solutions for the consumer. And so I think really we're in a phase now of getting to a place where, the marketing value of inclusivity is actually matched with products that actually deliver on that inclusivity in the broad market. And so, I think we see ourselves really as a conduit for that change. And Dia has always been a multi-category, multi-brand, multi-business line platform that's really most focused on figuring out how to solve for the best possible experience for plus size women. We have our own brands. There's a lot of things that we do ourselves, but at the end of the day, really creating that ecosystem for her where she has the full experience of style in a way that women in smaller sizes are able to take for granted, it is what we do. And so, we feel like we can play in almost every part of the market.
When you were in that research phase, what was there like a moment or a data point or some kind of triggering event to say, hey, this is like no longer a fun research thing, but it's now actually a business? Like in that year period between when you left Harvard to actually starting the company, what triggered that decision?
It was, there were probably a couple of things. One, there were just really interesting insights in talking to people that was kind of like, I feel like we can fix that. Like if this is really the problem, like I think that we could probably build a product that addresses that. And then as we started,
sorry to interrupt, but what was there an example? Like, what's an example of an insight that you might remember?
So like really where all of our research started was going back to this New York Times article. It highlighted 3 bloggers that were kind of up and comers in the world of plus size fashion. This was like a really kind of authentic, organic time with influencers. And so we reached out to all these women directly and we said, hey, we want to learn about how you see the market and what your followers really need. And they were all super happy to work with us. We gave out a bunch of like $100 Amazon gift cards and got like tens of thousands of survey responses to all kinds of questions, including phone numbers and email addresses. And
there's your initial list.
And we called everybody. Like we called as many people as we could and asked as many people as we could to talk to us. And you start connecting the dots of, what these women are saying. Like some of the interesting learnings were when we talk to women truly in every state and different professions, different age groups. And you would talk to them and they would say that they all shop in the same 3 to 4 places. Like there was such consumer concentration. And that was a really interesting thing for us to pick up on. The other thing was like we'd have this list of brands that were in plus, like really kind of householdy names like Calvin Klein or Ralph Lauren. And we'd say, hey, do you know that Ralph Lauren, goes up to a size X at the time, whatever, say size 22. And they're like, oh, really? No, I would have never thought that Ralph Lauren went up into those sizes. And so there was just like huge disconnect between like actually understanding what was available on the supply side and how a consumer could access it. And there's like a whole long list of these things that were kind of like, that's kind of interesting. Like, how do we actually get the 2 sides of the equation to talk to each other a little bit better? And how do we open up the options that are available to her as a result? And so we started, kind of like pitching ideas to these women who answered us through surveys. And every time we said, well, what if we could do this? They were like, oh, please do that. Like, could you do that? And it was just like, the responses that we were getting from all these, random ideas that we were pitching out of ways that we could build a business that would fix the problem it was met with such excitement that we thought there's a true love brand to be built here. Like there's a brand that could connect with this community on such a deep level and be a part of this consumer's life in a way that I think very few brands are really ever able to achieve. And that feels like whether we build this or not, this is something that needs to exist in the world. And we've been very fortunate. And then the last 5 years, we've had a real go of it. And we've certainly learned a lot along the way.
Yeah. Well, so you have this data point of like obviously clear feedback, but you had an interesting piece like, oh, whether it's us or someone else, what was the day when you're like, no, we're going to go try it?
I think there was a moment where it really became very clear to me that I had this very deep set of experiences. And really, like if you talk to most women, our relationships with our bodies are, among the most important relationships in our lives. And I just had these like very deep, transformative, particularly when I was a teenager, and these things are so uncomfortable experiences that I reflected on a lot over the course of my life. And I felt like I really understood on a very deep level. And then it turned out that there were 100 million women who had the exact same experience. And I thought, I know this. Like, I know what I want. And what I'm hearing is that this is an incredibly shared experience. And, I think what I can see now, 5 years in, is that I feel very, very fortunate for a lot of reasons related to my Dia journey. But the thing that I think summarizes it is that at Dia, I get to work on something that is personally incredibly important to me, but is intellectually so fascinating too. Like I just like, I, I have studied business all of my life. I've gone to business school. I went to Wharton undergrad. Like I believe that businesses are efficient. I believe that markets are efficient. I believe that, large opportunities don't go untapped for a long time. And yet this is one of them. And so I think that in every like really complicated problem, there's a lot of value to be created, and it's certainly not easy. If it was easy, the problem wouldn't exist. And I'm not going to tell you that we fully cracked the code yet. We work on it every single day. But it's really, personally extraordinarily meaningful, and intellectually, just like a fascinating problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so many elements to it, but you kind of just highlight even that anecdotal example of like, oh, I'm looking for great clothing and I didn't realize this great brand has clothing in my size. And I'm sure there's the marketer at Ralph Lauren who's like, oh, I wonder why no one's buying these size 22s. Like this population must not exist. Like my data must be wrong, when it's actually like you two should talk, or like there has to be some way.
Right.
And it's,
but if you think about it, like once you hear it, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, right? When is the last time you saw a woman above a size 0 in a Ralph Lauren ad? Never.
Yeah.
When is, if you, as a consumer, if you shop from a place where your standard expectation is that you're not included, that's you have to be convinced otherwise. You have to be told otherwise. And this is one of the reasons why I think that the changes that we've seen around the conversations and inclusivity broadly in the last couple of years in particular are so important, because I think we do see more representation today. I think that brands actually, I think it would be naive to think that brands were anything other than actively avoiding conversations with the plus size community in the past. And now it's actually a point of pride to be inclusive. And that's a really major shift.
So back then in 2014, and you please correct my dates if I have my research incorrect, but it seems like that's when Dia at least first comes to life in the world. What does that V1 look like? What did you obviously have to make a decision? Am I making my own clothes? Am I selling someone else's clothes? Describe what that first thing you ever put into the world for someone to buy looked like.
We basically rolled from phone calls and emails to research to a business with it seemed like seamlessly. We kind of joked that for a long time we ran a beta test log, because it was these beta testers that were, and then we're at some point we're like, I don't think that this Excel spreadsheet is going to work anymore. But really the goal in that initial phase, when for the most part we were both still employed, or I think most accurately called unemployed for some period of time, we just started shopping for people. So we told people, hey, like if you tell us what you want, we're going to go out and try to find it for you. Because what I want to be able to understand is exactly what does your shopping experience look like if you are a elementary school teacher in Nashville, if you are a healthcare worker in Omaha, if you are a stay-at-home mom in San Diego, if you are a retiree in Mississippi. Like I want to be able to shop in as many shoes as I can in this category to understand exactly what is she seeing. And so we started personally shopping for people, and we'd buy the clothes on our own, and we'd send it to them. Lydia was living in San Francisco at the time, and I was living in New York, and I can tell you every corner of Macy's Herald Square. Like everything on 34th Street, which is the only place where plus size clothing is sold in New York City. I can tell you inside and out. And we would literally go out and shop for people and mail it to them. Amazing. And then if they liked it, they gave us their credit card and we processed a payment.
Wow. So it's also done like sight unseen, in that like they could be like, thanks for the clothes. See you later.
And also, they trusted us. Like they literally, so we trusted them and they trusted us.
Yeah.
And it worked. There was a time, I'm not kidding, before we brought on our third co-founder, who was our CTO, or anything else, where Lydia and I were personally shopping for 1,000 women.
That's insane.
It was, I
That's
wish I had
absolutely
like a
insane.
step counter at the time, because I feel like I was probably doing like, I don't know, 50,000 steps a day.
Oh my God.
But it was such a powerful learning experience though. It really was. Like, I could tell you exactly what was available depending on your style, aesthetic, in what sizes, on the internet, in stores. And if we weren't finding it in stores in New York City and San Francisco, it didn't exist.
Yeah.
And that's where we started building.
So two unrelated but somewhat related questions. Who is the first person you shot for? Do you remember? Like, tell me about that person. Who's the woman you first shot for?
She's kind of she's the stuff of legends at Dia. Her name is Molly. I will keep her last name private for security reasons. But her name is Molly. She is a marketing executive in Wisconsin, and she's customer number one.
Wow.
She ended up inspiring our first and our largest in-house brand, which is called Molly Nizadora. And she, like, those early customers were literally willing to spend, like, not only kind of humor us with these shopping trips, but they would just spend so much time talking to us.
That's amazing.
And she was very, very impactful at Dia.
That's amazing. Do you remember what kind of outfit you had to curate for her? Like, what her ask was for that first one?
Sure. Yeah, what she's famous for at Dia is that we would always ask customers like how they describe their own style, which is like extraordinarily subjective, and so it took us a long time to really understand how to ask that question. But she was one that like immediately knew how she would describe her style. And she would always say that she's pumped up casual. And like, pumped up casual is like the inspiration for the brand that is named after her. And I think that it's like such a standard aesthetic in smaller sizes, but the reality is that what you may see at a Madewell or a J. Crew or something like that in terms of being put together, but clearly like comfortable and kind of casual, is just something that wasn't available in larger sizes at the time, and a big part of what we tried to recreate for her.
That's wow. So you get up to 1,000 people you're supporting, which is still insane. How long are you doing that before someone other than you or Lydia bought something? Like 2014, I guess, is when you're starting doing this. When does that stop happening?
So we probably did that for a year.
Wow.
Lydia was still at Google. So we didn't raise any money until we didn't raise any institutional capital until the end of 2015, December 2015. So we were, really boots on the ground, like learning and bootstrapping for a long time. It all honestly also was just very hard to raise money at the beginning. So we certainly didn't, intend to bootstrap for that long or to stay in kind of like beta for that long. But it took some time for us to be able to find investors who really believed in the idea.
Yeah, tell me more about that, because that's kind of the other topic I want to cover. I mean, that's why we've built our company here at Clearbank, is to try to solve that. But back in that era, once we ended up backing you, it looked like it was Lara Hippo was one of the early investors, and they had just backed Casper a couple of years earlier. So there was some taste of like some D2C success. But when you tried to pitch the idea to others outside of them, what would those conversations be like? What would be the objections or concerns, or what are the reasons why people pass?
I mean, look, most investors are going to say no to any idea that you present them. So like, I don't think that there's like, some of that is just par for the course. I think that, like, if I'm being totally honest, I think that we operate in a category that has a lot of bias. And I think that bias is a human bias. And so we should expect any process that is driven by humans to reflect that bias too. And I think investment decisions are definitely that. I think there's a lot of skepticism around the consumer, skepticism around the category. I think that there's a lot more focus today on female founders and, the role that VC can play in really, leveling the playing field from an access to capital perspective. But in 2014 and 2015, these really weren't conversations that were happening yet. I know that it's not that long ago, but the world has changed pretty dramatically.
Substantially.
And so, you kind of layer on a consumer that there was a healthy dose of skepticism around, 2 first-time female founders, and there were a lot of things that weren't really working in our favor.
Yeah. And so what do you think it was about the Lara Hippo team and I guess Mavron was the other that backed you? Like, what do you think clicked with them that didn't click with anyone else?
So it's actually those folks didn't participate in our seed round, but it was Founder Collective that ultimately pulled the trigger. And honestly, like, we just had a meaningful amount of revenue at that time. Like, we had bootstrapped the business to a place where we were actually generating, like, through brute force and like human endurance, we're generating a non-trivial amount of revenue. And they're like, okay, like,
that's reasonable.
Micah at Founder Collective is a great friend, and I don't mean to say that that's all. I'm sure he really,
but it certainly helps the case.
It helped.
Well, it's not only that. It's like not only are you revenue positive and maybe generating some good amount of profit, but you and Lindy have personally purchased, like, you're the payment processor. All the inventory is flowing through your hands.
Yeah. So.
So do you quit your full-time jobs when you raised that round, or was there a period where you were just living off of everything I bought, the styling fees or whatever the business model was at the time? Was there a point you had to bridge?
No. So I quit my job in 2014, and I was, I'm kind of like a burn the boats kind of person, like all in. In some ways, like, you kind of have to believe that failure is not an option and just like keep going, knowing that at some point something is going to turn in your favor and it's going to have all been worth it. So it was like a tough couple of years. There was nothing glamorous about it.
Yeah. So at what point then, how do you start doing deals with brands? Do you remember what was the first brand that you actually did a deal with? Because at some point you stopped buying from Macy's. I'm sure the store manager at Macy's is very sad after that day.
No, they hated it, which
really?
I never understood. I've meant to circle back and give them feedback on this because, well, I think in New York City, what they're very worried about is that, like, people are buying a lot of inventory for like photo shoots and then they're going to return it. And we never returned anything because we ended up selling everything. And I was always like, no, you should let me do this. I promise you, like, this is going to be the best thing that happens to your plus.
I'm here every day. I'm here literally every day.
And I literally never return anything. Let me buy this. But sometimes they didn't. They were very skeptical. But I think that our first, I honestly can't remember what our first wholesale deal was. I think that we probably had the volumes to do wholesale. We just didn't have the capital until we raised money. And so it was, a matter of just having enough money to be able to do these instead of like literally, aggregating inventory every day. So like getting things in bigger chunks. But the good news is that because we had been selling all these brands for so long, I knew exactly what was good and what wasn't good. And it was, there weren't a lot of inventory mistakes. We kind of knew what was going to sell.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. This story reminds me a lot of, so I went through a program when I first started, or I guess where I started my first business was this program called Next 36. And the guy who started it was he actually now teaches at Harvard in their MBA program, but he essentially tried to take the Harvard MBA education, the entrepreneurial parts of it, and graft it into like a separate program in Canada. So it started in 2011, actually, was when I was going through that. And one of my favorite lessons that I was taught there was this idea of like, how do you get access to cheap information? And obviously to put a lot of work into it, but this is such a great example of like, if you didn't do that, how would you know what SKUs to buy? You'd probably burn a lot of money wasting on like wastage and whatever. And here it's like, no, like I've literally sold this blouse or these pants 100 times. So I am 100% confident that I can put the money behind it to do it. And the benefit is you got paid for it too. It's not free information. It's like profitable information. Like the case study I remember, I'm pretty sure it was like Crunch Gyms, where I think they had like a mail order or some kind of a digital or mail order kind of product back in the day. And they used the data from that to figure out where to open up their gyms. It's like, a bunch of people are subscribing in Wisconsin. Like we should open up there. And that's probably what's going to happen now with all these facilities that are now going online first. they're probably seeing pockets of like, oh, I didn't think, a bunch of people in Utah would be subscribing to my thing. Like I should probably open up a facility there. And otherwise they would have never known, otherwise. So I love that.
Totally.
I love that. So the business eventually started doing wholesale and deals like that. And the business has grown tremendously since. Obviously, lots has changed that you don't have to go buy the clothes yourself. You have you're a retailer now, and that you've created your own brands and things like that. As you try to grow the business today, just to touch briefly on tactics, like what's that strategy look like for you in terms of channels, in terms of brand, in terms of SKUs? People are always very curious about when you're at scale, what does that look like and how's that changed? Could you touch a little bit more on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, honestly, I think that there's like a pre-2020 strategy and there's a post-2020 strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is very category specific, but we operate in a category that has been dramatically transformed by COVID. Mm-hmm. Most of our incumbent competitors were store-based and have just gone through dramatic upheaval in the course of the year. We track store closures and Plus as an example. And from the fall of 2019 through today, almost 45% of plus size stores have closed their doors.
That's great.
And so I think for us, it's kind of like it's bittersweet because as a consumer, it's heartbreaking to see options decline in the category after as an industry worked so hard for the last 5 years to increase them. But, for us as a leader in the community, I think it just really reshapes how we think we need to be able to show up for her and really step into the gaps that are being created across the category in an experience that now has been in a very abrupt way shifted online, not temporarily. Like there are a lot of categories that may have temporarily seen a bump, but these stores are closed. They're not going to come back. We fully expect that shift to be permanent. And so really kind of thinking about how our offering evolves to be able to really step into the gaps that have been created through COVID, I think is not a temporary strategy for us at this point.
Other than the categories like swimwear as an example of what you launched, so other than new SKUs, which is one obvious answer to fill the gap of what's no longer there, is there anything from a community perspective or a strategy perspective that you're starting to implement to kind of make up for this lost in the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think like most brands, a lot of the focus for us in 2020 was more around conversation than it was around commerce, and really just staying engaged in a moment in time in our consumers' lives where our product wasn't that important to her, right? Like we all bought sweatsuits and we sold more sweatsuits in 2020 than I think we ever thought we would in the lifetime of Dia. But outside of that, apparel wasn't a place where she was investing for the most part. And really being able to be there for her in the categories where she was still shopping, athleisure and active, and soft pants is like the death of hard pants in 2020.
I finally bought one pair of new jeans, but I bought it from this brand called Collar because it's a Toronto brand here that's like stretchy jeans. So it's like, okay, if I'm going to wear jeans, I'm going to buy ones that kind of feel like sweatpants.
Yeah. I can tell you that I feel like 2020 may have been the permanent death of hard pants. Either we're going to like go back to like an era of very stiff denim or hard pants are gone forever, but something has changed. Anyways, but really being involved with our community was the name of the game. And being a source of content that really resonated with her was so critical. So I think that there were the obvious things that a lot of brands did in terms of just getting way more active on, live interactions. But we also, we just kind of invested in the community and brought those stories onto our platform. So one of the big initiatives for us last year was around really trying to figure out what specialty boutiques and Plus were doing through the pandemic. And going into holiday period last year, we actually had what we called the Dia Holiday Market, which is we let all plus size boutiques across the country sell their stuff through Dia free of charge to be able to effectively bring them online more quickly than they could have done that really themselves. And, keep their doors open during holiday, which was probably like the highlight of the year for me.
That's amazing.
And I think that there are just a lot of ways of really understanding what the community needed and being able to really kind of step into those gaps, which is ultimately the role that, we think that we should be playing.
Well, interesting. That was what I was really going to ask about it, especially when I think about, a plus size store in a smaller community or city, I imagine there's a huge part of the community that's lost as part of it, because if it's the only option, you're probably going there quite often. You probably have gotten to know the staff and the people. And for me, fitness is a really big part of my life, and seeing gyms close in a similar way, which are very regional businesses with a regional community. So this is very, very a tactical question, but for anyone who's thinking about, replicating it in their own respective communities, how did you figure out the logistics of, like, if someone makes an order, like, were you stocking it or they just fulfilled it?
So, I mean, for us, it was a little bit easier on the technical side because a portion of Dia operates as a marketplace. And so we were basically able to quickly onboard these vendors as marketplace vendors. And, all that tooling was already in place. And it was just a matter of being very proactive about going out and finding these boutiques. And we had dozens of boutiques who wanted to be a part of the program, and working with them in a very hands-on way, and obviously at no cost, to make sure that they could have product live in time for, Q4, which is such a critical time in retail. So we were fortunate in that it was really a matter of redeploying technology that we already had, specifically in that context.
So I didn't even realize the marketplace aspect, because that is I don't even know how to word this. I don't see a reason why Dia&Co would not dominate this entire industry, because all the incumbents are struggling because of all their brick and mortar just does not support this kind of model. Not to say there's the death of brick and mortar, but in general, that's what's happening for these smaller companies, right? You have now a marketplace that then, if I'm trying to buy plus size clothing, I'm not going to Amazon, I'm not going to Walmart or Target. They have their own marketplaces, but it's not curated to the extent that you guys are doing it. So what are you most afraid of, or what do you spend your time thinking about to make sure that does happen? Because it's I'm not to belittle the hard work of your entire team, because it's very, very hard to do what you're doing. But it seems like in a very positive an inevitability that your position.
I agree. I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. I think that it all comes down to timing, right? I think that there's so many moving pieces, and there's a window of opportunity that's open now that we're so excited about, and we plan to take full advantage of. But timing is everything. And I say that, for example, with right now, we're in a moment in time where brands want to be in plus, but it's very hard for them to figure out how to do it. We can do that, right? We have the community, we have the technical expertise, we can be the partner of choice. I don't think that the conversation around inclusivity is a fad or a trend. I think it truly is a movement that's here to stay. But, really, I think for us, striking while the iron's hot, in terms of making sure that this moves from potential on the marketplace side and in these partnerships, for example, to kind of full-fledged reality, while the brands are so eager to do it, is an important thing for us to be focused on.
What do you think the constraints are for the brands in doing, like, some of the more major brands? Because you can't say it's resources, because they have capital, right?
Yeah.
It's know-how. You can give them the know-how. Is it just a matter of prioritization, or?
I mean, I think that the reality is that it hasn't been a good time for most traditional retailers in a long time. And so we're constantly playing a game of prioritization, and this customer moves up and down the priority rank like any other customer would, right? And so we're seeing large brands like Loft, for example, which was actually a beloved brand in Plus, announced a couple weeks ago that they're pulling out of the category entirely. Wow. And, as a business person, I'm sure there's a lot of valid reasons why it just did not make sense for them. They went through bankruptcy last year, and there's a whole host of other things going on. And there's, I'm sure a lot of very good decision-making on the financial end of the spectrum, in making that decision. But, I think it's really important that we're able to step in and maintain, the presence of these brands in this market before they pull the plug completely.
Yeah. This is like, I always love having like random brainstorm ideas on these conversations, but to me, this is like screaming for some type of like private equity style. I don't know how you do, like Loft as an example of, like, could you acquire the rights in some way to the brand / like IP / customer list of all the stores that just closed, plus the brands that are pulling out, and somehow you maintain them in a way that is like financially viable for Dia&Co. And it's just like, how do we find someone to go invest this and create the Dia&Co fund or whatever you call it to acquire and roll up all this stuff? Because it's, to me, why it screams PE. It's like, oh, those on the own, I can see 100% why they're not going to be, they are going to bankruptcy and going to disappear. But when you plug it into Dia&Co, it's going to be the complete opposite of like, it's a good brand or not. You can save the plus size loft brand as an example. And so it's just where it started of like, this is so obvious. How can we make it exist? How can we make it real?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's a continual game in sequencing and prioritization for all of us. Right. And I think we just have to try to continue to get the sequencing right.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I know we're coming up on time. So really, I'd just love to finish off with, and you can think of this. We've talked a lot about professionally where Dia&Co, we want to take that. So that's very obvious. It's a clear passion and goal in your life. Personally, what are you most excited about doing this year? Let's assume New York opens up and all of that. What are you most excited to do next?
Yeah, I mean, I'm feeling incredibly optimistic. I really am. I am post both doses of my vaccine, and I feel like my lifestyle hasn't changed, but I just feel like the world is so much lighter and brighter on the other side of the vaccine. And I think for me, the thing that has been hardest around the pandemic is the fact that nobody in my family lives in New York. My family's in Kuwait or in Miami, and it has just felt so far away to be anywhere but, kind of New York City. And so I am very much looking forward to the world feeling smaller again and being able to travel and reconnect first and foremost with family, but even friends who, it's kind of crazy how long it's been since we really spent time in person with the vast majority of people in our communities. So
well, for me, I used to spend a lot of time in New York, and I have people in San Francisco and LA I loved seeing, and I would see them relatively regularly. And now I haven't left this place here in Toronto. If you read all the crazy stuff we got featured in the Washington Post for whatever people's opinions are about what's happening here. So it's not a show about that, but rest assured, I am 100% on your side. I cannot wait to get to see you again in person in New York and to see friends around the world. So with that, thank you again for taking the time. I was always very fascinated about what you built with Dia&Co, and I'm like a million times more energized about the vision you have. So if there's any way we can be of help, you know where we are. I always hope you have a great rest of your day. And to everyone watching, thank you for tuning in. We have a show tomorrow with Moise Ali, the founder of Native, and more to come next week.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Daniel. It was great to see you.
Great to see you too. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.